if there's no longer confidence that the electoral system can allow you to change government peacefully, what will happen? Citizens will resort to unconstitutional means of getting to power. It's simple. And we can't close our eyes to what's happening across the West African continent. That we are surrounded by countries that failed to have free and fair election, and the result was military rule. That's a fact. The Nigerian democracy, it has at the verge of collapse. That's really only those who pretend that it's not about to collapse. And it won't just collapse. The nation might as well collapse with it. Anybody who has eyes to see, whose eyes have not been blinded by greed or over-involvement in the politics of this country, by now knows that there is a deepening loss of confidence in the electoral ballot or the ballot system or electoral system to help change government. The last election almost forecloses the possibility that with the current INEC, with the current structure and the current judicial setup, many people, many reasonable people would argue that there's no chance of removing a government that is not performing in 2027. And so I think that even if it was very urgent in 2022-23 to fight for electoral reform, it's actually more urgent now that there should be a coalition of civil society and political parties, especially opposition political parties, to take seriously the demand of real, not peripheral, real electoral reform. We're going to share our thoughts about what that real electoral reform means in a second. But let me say that the real point for us is Nigeria does not have all the options available to it. That's for real. Anybody tell you that we have is joking. If you watch the political events in the last couple of weeks, and if you also read the Guardian newspaper editorial of 2 days ago that the presidency reacted sharply to, what it points to is the fact that there is now, and there should be now, serious concern about the safety of our democracy. No matter what happened, if citizens can block military vehicle and be urging for military takeover, the truth is the only attraction of democracy is that twofold. One, that democracy provides incentive for good performance. So democracy, through its peculiar incentive that people in office can be removed, help them to focus on promoting the well-being of citizens. So democracy's only merit, or two of its merits, is that somehow, through that mechanism, it can create good outcomes. The second merit of democracy is that democracy can stabilize a polity. So if people are disputing on the right to govern and have free and fair process, then they will not invest in self-help and violence. They will invest in strategy to convince the people to keep an eye on the governing elite, to criticize them, so that they too will replace them through peaceful process. And that's what the Constitution talks about, democratic, that nobody should take over power except by democratic means. So if elections are no longer free and fair, if there's no longer confidence that the electoral system can allow you to change government peacefully, what will happen? Citizens will resort to unconstitutional means of getting to power. It's simple. And we can't close our eyes to what's happening across the West African continent. That we are surrounded by countries that failed to have free and fair election, and the result was military rule. That's a fact. That's a fact. That's what happened in Burkina Faso. That's what happened in Niger. That's what happened in Mali. That's what happened in Guinea at some point. The moment nobody has confidence in the electoral system, then it's a matter of when before democracy is uprooted. We talk about judicial management of electoral disputes. We have come to a point where we have to acknowledge that part of the crisis of the electoral system is now residing with the courts. And there are three areas we want to look at. Of course, judicial corruption is bigger than us. It's an elephant in the room. It won't be solved through electoral reform. It has to be solved through a comprehensive reform of the judiciary. There's no question around judicial corruption. But we are more concerned with jurisprudence of election. And two areas. First, I think that those who drafted the rules of petition, electoral petition rules, made a mistake. They should align those procedures to the Evidence Act. We have seen cases where, for example, you ask somebody to front load all evidence, he's going to use all the everything, and he has 12 days after election to go and file the petition. And INEC will not give him the documents. If he doesn't file it, no case. He goes and files it, and it turns out that maybe after filing it, the court gives an order asking that INEC should produce report. INEC produce it, the court receive it, and then they said, no, it was not filed before. What kind of nonsense is that? A court ordered evidence, and the evidence came. That was the case of Kogi. So there's no need to realign the evidence procedure for election cases. Elections are like any other cases. There should be no reason why courts should overlook clear evidence of electoral malpractices under a very perverse technical rule. Secondly, judicial officers should issue judicial directions. Why should you have INEC, IREV? Results on IREV shows collected in real time, shows that this party scored 4%. IREV is supposed to be, as the court said, Supreme Court says, oh, IREV is not a collection system, but that's true. But what's the IREV? IREV is a system that gives you proof of actual counting, because they count at the polling unit, they sign off, is that also, and they upload. Collection then happens, and somehow you overlook the real-time capture of the actual result and use the many hours, many days collation with alterations and mutilations on paper. I have not seen where that happens. Now think about elections even in India, a bigger than us. In a day, results are out. It's electronically transmitted, real time. People know the result. In the US today, maybe how the result will go, we don't know. It may be midday, before 10 hours, before 5 hours voting started, they will declare result. There's no magic about this. How can you overlook the result captured real time? And then you allow results captured hours after with biro. I have seen something like that. So I think there's need for judicial direction that says, look, the whole essence of election petition is to restore credibility back to voters. It's not for judges to do fanciful sorcery to declare winner or no winner. It's simply for the courts to say, get us back to where the voters voted. It's not the court who elect candidates. So there must be the need now for judicial officers, the Chief Justice of the Federation, or the Federal High Court, or the Court of Appeal, to issue the right directives to judges. Your job, you can't see the clear, if you see clear result, that's what it is. And the reason IRF should, by law, be made to be determinative. Results are collected from polling units, they are posted, and that's the result. There's no ritual of, imagine what's called collection. People will now carry with leg, go to local government capital, go to state capital. You go to five stages, then finally somebody will count it, decide whether he will accept or not, and then will declare whatever he likes. Then 2 days, 4 days after, INEC starts reposting IRF. I mean, that's ridiculous. In the election today, results finished, they are still changing IRF. They're changing IRF. So what mockery is this? So I think this is now time to deal with this once and for all. And don't forget where we started from. Anybody deceiving you that this country is not at the verge of collapse is a joker. Any country who says that if we continue this election to 2027, we will remain a country is joking. I can tell you that, there's something that happened in the Bible. Some of us who are Christians. It says, Jesus was telling, it says, if the things that were done, we were doing, it's not enough. It's not what was done in Sodom and Gomorrah, that they were wiped off. So how dare you think you will survive? The things that made Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger collapse are not more than what we are doing today to ourselves. So somehow we wish that if we issue a press statement, we will divert the tragedy. That is wrong. The final, go back. So we talk about judicial management. And again, that's another one I missed out, is around, so the final point we wanted to talk about is, apart from INEC, yes, we talk about the primary process, and then, just 1 second to get, so yes, then electoral finance, I didn't mention about campaign finance. Abuja School went to court and got an order that INEC should issue directives for campaign finance. We saw the debate over Aisha Yusuf and the Labour Party, whether their records are good or not. Now, these confusions abide because there's no guideline, comprehensive guideline for campaign finance. We are taking with INEC. We won the case at the High Court. INEC has no guideline. INEC is doing nothing. INEC is only doing election. The day of election, they rig it and go home and call civil society again to talk about planning for the next one. Everything they ought to do, they never do. INEC is not just corrupt, it's incompetent, thoroughly. How can you have a law? The Constitution says that illicit funds, campaign finance from outside will not come to the country, number one. Number two, Electoral Act talks about limits, individual contribution and spend. Still, INEC has no process to ask parties to keep accounts. Now look at what happens elsewhere. Before you declare as a candidate in the US, for example, when you declare, every moment you issue a statement how much you have received, how much you have spent. Now, how do you know money laundering? How do we track criminals who are investing in election? Okay, how do we even track money used to bribe officials? So you hear every year that to run for Senate in Nigeria, you need 10 billion. People tell you to run for. That 10 billion is not spent on the media, it's not spent on logistics, it's not spent. This is money perhaps used to corrupt public officials for electoral purposes. How can you track it if you don't have a comprehensive reporting mechanism?
This whole deep dive is based on one source. It's a YouTube video called "You Are Not Just Corrupt, You Are Incompetent." Prof. Sam Amadi says Nigeria at the verge of collapse. Professor Amadi is a legal and public policy expert, and he really doesn't hold back in this video. He's arguing that Nigeria is on the brink of collapse and that it all comes down to a loss of faith in the electoral system. He even compares the situation to Sodom and Gomorrah. That's pretty dramatic, don't you think?
It is a pretty stark comparison, but I think he's using that strong analogy to really emphasize how serious this is, that things need to change and fast.
Why does this loss of faith in elections matter so much?
Well, Professor Amadi makes the case that democracies have two big benefits. First, they incentivize good governance. Leaders are more likely to act in the best interests of the people if they want to be reelected. And second, democracies create political stability. Because if people believe they can rob out change through voting, they're less likely to resort to violence or other undemocratic means.
So a healthy democracy encourages peaceful transitions of power based on what the people want.
Exactly.
It's pretty straightforward.
Right. But the problem, as Professor Amadi sees it, is that these benefits completely fall apart when people stop believing that their vote actually matters. And actually, he makes some unsettling comparisons to what's been happening in other West African countries, like Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and Guinea.
What happened there?
Each of those countries had flawed elections that ultimately led to military coups. So that regional context makes Professor Amadi's concerns even more urgent. It's a reminder that democracy is fragile.
Yeah, it's a real reminder that this could happen anywhere. It's not just something we read about in history books. So this leads us to another point Professor Amadi brings up: the role of the judiciary in resolving election disputes.
Yes, and he's very critical of how things have been handled so far. He's particularly concerned about three main issues, starting with judicial corruption.
Oh yeah, we hear a lot about that. But this is the deep dive, so let's go a little deeper. Why is corruption especially problematic when it comes to election disputes?
Well, think about it. If judges can be bribed or influenced, it undermines the whole idea of a fair election. Someone could literally buy their way into power regardless of who actually got the votes.
Right. That makes sense. So what are the other two areas of concern when it comes to the judiciary?
Okay, so Professor Amadi talks about these misaligned procedures. Basically, what he means is that the rules for dealing with election petitions don't line up with the Evidence Act. And to understand why this is a problem, you need to know that the Evidence Act sets the rules for what kind of evidence is allowed in court. It's like a rule book to make sure that only reliable and relevant evidence is used in making decisions.
Okay, so I see where this is going. So what happens when these rules clash?
It creates this situation where evidence that might be perfectly fine under the Evidence Act gets thrown out in an election dispute. Professor Amadi actually gives an example of a court rejecting evidence that it had previously ordered. It's like the legal system is working against itself, making it really hard to fairly resolve these disputes.
That sounds incredibly frustrating. You follow all the rules, you gather the evidence, and then it just gets tossed out on a technicality. So what's Professor Amadi's third concern?
He says that there's a lack of clear guidance for judges when it comes to dealing with these disputes. He's basically saying that judges need more direction on how to prioritize the credibility of voters. He even calls some of the judicial rulings fanciful sorcery, which I thought was funny.
Fanciful sorcery.
Yeah.
That's a good one. What I find interesting is that Professor Amadi isn't necessarily saying these judges are intentionally corrupt or that they're trying to rig the system. He's saying that they're getting bogged down in legal technicalities and forgetting what really matters, the will of the voters.
Right. He's calling for a more common sense approach, where the focus is on determining who actually won the election based on the votes, not getting lost in legal minutia.
So we've talked about this loss of faith in elections and the problems with the judiciary. Where does Professor Amadi go from there?
Well, he turns his attention to INS, the Independent National Electoral Commission, and honestly, you can almost hear the frustration in his voice. He's especially perplexed by how they've dealt with the IRV system, which stands for Real-Time Election Results Capture System.
IREV. I've heard of that. That's supposed to provide real-time election results, right? Kind of like what they have in India and the United States.
Exactly. It's designed to make the whole process more transparent and faster. But Professor Amadi's point is, what's the point of having this technology if you're not going to use it properly? He says that they're still relying on manually collected results, which are known for errors and potential manipulation.
So he's saying that Nigeria has a system that could make elections more trustworthy, but they're not using it.
Basically, yeah. It's like they're intentionally sticking with a system that's more open to rigging. And that brings us to another area where Professor Amadi doesn't hold back at all: campaign financing.
Ah, yes. Campaign financing. Always a touchy subject. What does Professor Amadi have to say about it?
He's deeply frustrated with the lack of transparency and the lack of enforcement when it comes to campaign financing. He points out that Nigeria's Electoral Act actually has rules about this, like prohibiting illegal funds and setting limits on how much can be spent. But INTs isn't doing much to enforce those rules. It's almost as if they're just words on paper.
So we don't really know who's funding these elections or what they're getting in return.
It's all very murky. And this is where he compares it to the system in the U.S. where candidates have to give detailed financial reports. He's not saying the U.S. system is perfect, but at least it's more transparent, which Nigeria definitely lacks.
It makes you wonder who's bankrolling these campaigns and what are they getting out of it? It's like this black box where we don't see how decisions are really being made.
Yeah.
Professor Amadi really goes after INTs here. He doesn't just accuse them of being corrupt. He also calls them incompetent.
Yeah, and that's an important difference. Professor Amadi seems to be saying that their incompetence is in some ways even worse than any corruption. He's frustrated that they don't have good reporting mechanisms and that they're more focused on manipulating things than on making sure elections are fair.
So he's saying it's not just about bad people, it's about a system that just doesn't work.
Right, and it's the system failure that Professor Amadi says is driving Nigeria to the edge. Like, corruption is one thing. You can fight it. You can strengthen anti-corruption institutions and promote transparency. But incompetence, that suggests a lack of ability or even willingness to just do the job, right?
And when that job is ensuring free and fair elections, the foundation of any democracy, well, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
It makes you think about what he said earlier about how this is affecting people psychologically.
Oh, absolutely. When people lose faith in the system, they start thinking their vote doesn't matter. And it leads to apathy and cynicism and can even make room for extremism to grow. Think back to those countries we talked about that had military coups. It's a scary reminder that this isn't just a theory, it's a real danger.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The system's broken, so people lose faith, which weakens the system even more, and so on.
Exactly, a vicious cycle. And that's why what Professor Amadi says about solutions is so important. He doesn't just give up and say it's over. He actually offers some concrete ways to fix things.
So let's talk about those solutions. What does he propose?
Well, he goes back to the judiciary. He says those rules for election petitions should be aligned with the Evidence Act. This would create a clearer legal framework for settling disputes.
That sounds like a good place to start.
Yeah.
But even with those reforms, wouldn't the system still be vulnerable to corruption?
Right.
I mean, we already know judicial corruption is an issue in Nigeria.
You're absolutely right. And Professor Amadi knows this is a deep-rooted problem that needs a lot of work to fix. But he's saying that even in a flawed system, we can still improve things. It's about taking steps, even if they're small, in the right direction.
Right. Like they say, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Even small changes can have an impact. What about the IRV system? That seems like a pretty simple fix.
It does, doesn't it? Professor Amadi seems to be genuinely confused about why INS isn't fully using this technology. It would increase transparency and make manipulation less likely. If it's already in place, why not use it to its full potential?
Right. And that brings us back to the campaign financing issue. It's a big problem, but it also seems really tough to address. Where do you even begin with something like that?
It is complicated, but Professor Amadi's point is that we need more transparency as a first step. If we don't know who's funding elections and why it's impossible to hold anyone accountable, he uses the US as an example, not because it's perfect, but because it shows the value of transparency. Imagine if Nigerian candidates had to be just as open about their finances.
That would be a big change.
Yeah.
But realistically, there are probably a lot of powerful people in Nigeria who benefit from the way things are now. They're not going to give up their power easily.
You're right. Professor Amadi's analysis doesn't sugarcoat the challenges that Nigerian democracy is up against. But even with all that, there's a little bit of hope. He's reminding us that change is possible, but it needs everyone to work together. It needs citizens to participate, to demand better from their leaders, and to hold them accountable.
So it's not just about fixing the system from the top down. It's also about citizens pushing for change from the bottom up.
Exactly. And that's where I think this deep dive gets really interesting for our listeners. Professor Amadi's analysis isn't just some academic theory. This is about real people's lives. It's about the future of Nigeria and the kind of society its people want to live in.
It's about making sure everyone has a voice and that their vote actually counts.
Exactly. When people lose that faith, when they think the system is rigged, it has huge consequences. It can lead to apathy, cynicism, and even violence. Think about what's at stake here: the stability of the country, the well-being of the people, and the hope for a fairer future.
And you put it like that, it really emphasizes how important this is.
It does, right? And that's why Professor Amadi's message is so vital. He's saying that democracy isn't just something you watch. It's something we all need to actively participate in and protect.
So what does active participation look like? What can everyday people do to make a difference?
That's a great question, and I think it's one we should discuss more. Professor Amadi focuses on the problems with the structure and processes, which is important. But there's another side to this that we haven't talked about yet: the role of individual citizens.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. What role do citizens play in all this?
Well, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by how big the problems in Nigeria are. It's easy to become cynical or just disconnect from the whole process. But at its heart, I think Professor Amadi's message is one of hope. He's saying change is possible, but people have to actively participate. It means speaking truth to power and believing in the power of collective action.
So it's about more than just voting. It's about being informed and involved and holding those in power accountable.
Exactly. It's about realizing that the future of the country doesn't just depend on politicians and institutions. It depends on everyone working together.
It's about taking responsibility and refusing to let apathy and cynicism win.
Yes, and that brings us back to Professor Amadi's analogy of Sodom and Gomorrah. He's basically saying that Nigeria is at a turning point. Its citizens have to choose between apathy and action, between being complacent and working towards a better future.
So which path will they choose? Will they give in to despair and disengagement like Professor Amadi warns against? Or will they rise to the occasion and demand a system that truly represents them?
That's the big question, isn't it? And only the people of Nigeria can answer it. Professor Amadi's analysis gives us a way to understand how complex the situation is and how much is at stake.
But in the end, the future of Nigerian democracy depends on the choices its people make both individually and together. It really is a turning point. It makes you think about what Professor Amadi said before about how democracy isn't a spectator sport. We can't just sit back and expect other people to fix things for us.
You got it. It's like anything else in life you really care about. You got to put in the effort. You got to be involved and willing to step up and do your part. Professor Amadi laid out the problems, but the real work starts with the people.
So where do you think people should focus their energy? What can everyday Nigerians do to make a real difference?
Well, first, they got to be informed right. They need to understand the system, their rights, and how to make their voices heard effectively. It's about building a culture of civic engagement where citizens have the power to hold their leaders and institutions accountable.
So civic education is crucial. It's not enough to just complain about what's wrong or get discouraged and check out completely.
Exactly. People need to be engaged and willing to get involved, whether that's voting, advocating for reforms, or holding their elected officials responsible. Every little thing counts. It's about realizing that the fate of the nation isn't just on the politicians and institutions, but on all of us working together.
That makes a lot of sense. If people don't believe their actions have any impact, why would they bother to participate? I keep thinking back to Professor Amadi's Sodom and Gomorrah analogy. He wasn't just talking about some theoretical idea. He was talking about the potential collapse of a whole country.
Absolutely. It's a wake-up call. He's telling Nigerians to choose action over apathy, commitment over complacency. The future depends on the choices they make, both individually and collectively. It's a powerful message that applies way beyond Nigeria, too. It speaks to what it really means to be a citizen in a democracy, to be actively involved in shaping your own future.
It's a message that resonates with anyone who believes in the power of people. Professor Amadi's analysis has been really eye-opening and thought-provoking. He's shown us the problems Nigeria's democracy is facing, but he's also offered some hope, reminding us that change is possible if people are willing to fight for it.
I agree. This has been a fascinating deep dive, and I hope everyone listening got a lot out of it.
Me too. We covered a lot of ground today, from the lack of trust in elections to the role of the judiciary and INE, to the importance of transparency in campaign financing, and finally the key role of individual citizens. It's been a reminder that democracy is delicate and that we always need to be on guard to protect it.
Definitely. And as we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. Don't let this conversation end here. Professor Amadi gave us a lot to consider, but now it's up to each of us to decide how we want to respond. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never underestimate the power you have to make a difference.